Sometimes fate arrives in a dusty wagon, carrying everything but what we expect. Petter adjusted his hat against the relentless afternoon sun and watched the cloud of dust approach down the road that cut through his property. It had been 3 months since she sent the letter to the Denver marriage agency. 3 months, imagining what the woman who agreed to marry a lonely farmer in the middle of nowhere would be like. The correspondence had been brief but promising. Sarah, 23, a teacher, willing to start a new life in the West. He kept the last letter in his shirt pocket, next to the heart that beat faster with each meter that the cart traveled. The hot wind swept across the dry land, raising small whirlpools that danced between the cacti and the creeping plants. His farm wasn't much, but it was honest. 200 head of cattle, a solid wooden house that he built himself, and enough land for a man to work until the end of his life. He wasn't rich, but he didn't owe anyone anything either. This had to be worth something to a woman who was looking for stability. The wagon finally stopped in front of the fence of his property, and the coachman got out to help the passengers. Petter felt his stomach tighten when he saw the first figure emerge from the vehicle. She was a woman, no doubt, but she did not correspond at all to the description she had received. She was older, perhaps in her 30s, with brown hair tied up in a stern bun and a simple travel dress covered in road dust. The woman looked around with calculating eyes, measuring every detail of the property with the precision of someone who was used to assessing situations quickly. His movements were decisive, practical, without the hesitation one would expect from someone arriving in a completely strange place. When her eyes met Peter's, she didn't look away. On the contrary, he walked directly towards him with firm steps that made the dry earth creak under his boots. Behind her, a second figure got out of the wagon. This one corresponded more to the description that Petter had received. Young, blonde, with a more delicate dress and hesitant movements. She stood next to the wagon, looking nervously at the house, at the barren land around, at everything but the man who had sent for her. The older woman stopped a few feet from Petter and studied him with the same attention he had devoted to the property moments before. There was no smile on her face, nor the nervous courtesy one would expect from a first date. There was something more solid there, more direct. Silence stretched between them as the wind continued its relentless dance across the plain. The coachman unloaded 2 suitcases from the wagon and laid them down, clearly eager to leave before the sun began to set. Petter knew he needed to say something, but the words seemed to have dried up in his throat like the earth beneath his feet. The older woman finally broke the silence, not with words of introduction or courtesy, but with a direct question that cut through the hot air like a sharp blade. Her voice carried a natural authority, the kind that comes from someone who is used to making difficult decisions and living with the consequences. Petter felt that his life had just taken a completely unexpected turn. The letter in his pocket seemed to burn against his chest, reminding him of all the expectations he had built up over the past few months. The surrounding farm remained the same, but something fundamental had changed the moment that Wagon stopped on his property. Fate, he realized, had its own plans, and sometimes those plans come in the form of a woman who wasn't who you expected, but maybe was just who you needed. The older woman folded her arms and stared at Petter with eyes that had seen too many disappointments in life. There was no hostility in her posture, but there was also not the submission that many men expected to find in a woman arriving in the West. She seemed to be measuring not only the man before her, but the entire situation she was in. The coachman cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the silence that stretched between the 3 of them. He had taken this route many times, transporting mail-order brides to lone farmers, and he could recognize when something wasn't following the expected route. His restless hands fiddled at the reins as he looked at the sun as it began to sink below the horizon. Petter finally found his voice, though it sounded hoarser than he intended. He introduced himself simply, mentioning his name and confirming that he was the one who had sent the letters to Denver. His words seemed small in the face of the imposing presence of the woman, who continued to study him with those piercing eyes. The young blonde finally approached, walking with small, hesitant steps. When he got close enough, Petter could see that she had been crying during the trip. Her eyes were red and swollen, and she kept her head down, as if trying to make herself invisible. She mumbled a confirmation that it was Sarah, the woman with whom he had exchanged letters, but her voice was so low that it could barely be heard above the wind. The older woman placed a protective hand on Sarah's shoulder and introduced herself as Elizabeth, the young woman's older sister. Her voice carried a firmness that contrasted drastically with Sarah's apparent fragility. She explained that she had decided to accompany her sister on the journey, that she could not allow a young woman to make such a journey alone to marry a complete stranger. Petter felt a mixture of confusion and admiration for Elizabeth's determination. It was not common for a woman to take such an initiative, especially when she had not been invited. But there was something about his posture that commanded respect. She wasn't asking permission to stay, was informing a decision he had already made. The coachman announced that he must leave before nightfall, as he knew the dangers of the road when darkness fell over the territory. He had fulfilled his part of the agreement, transporting the passengers to the agreed destination. What would happen from then on was no longer his responsibility. Elizabeth picked up both suitcases from the floor with efficient movements, demonstrating a physical strength that surprised Petter. There was no feminine delicacy in her gestures, but rather the practicality of someone used to taking care of herself and others. Sarah remained motionless, as if she was still processing the reality of her new situation. The wagon departed, leaving a new cloud of dust in the air, and the three were left alone in the immensity of the property. The silence that followed was different from the previous one. There was now a practical need to make decisions, to define how that unexpected situation would be resolved. Petter looked at his house, mentally calculating the available space. He had built only 2 rooms, one for himself and one that he intended to share with his future wife. Elizabeth's presence significantly complicated the arrangements she had planned. The wind continued its constant dance across the plain, carrying with it the dry smell of the earth and the resistant plants that managed to survive in that hostile environment. The shadows began to grow, reminding everyone that the night in the west could be as unforgiving as the day. Elizabeth broke the silence with a practical suggestion about where they could spend the night, demonstrating that she had already analyzed the situation and reached conclusions about how to proceed. Her ability to adapt quickly impressed Petter, who was still trying to process how his life had completely changed in a matter of minutes. Sarah finally looked up and looked directly at Petter for the first time. What he saw there was not the hope or curiosity he hoped to find in his future wife, but rather fear and uncertainty. It was as if she was staring at a precipice from which she didn't know if she would be able to return. Petter's house seemed smaller than ever as the three crossed the threshold of the main door. Elizabeth scanned every corner with expert eyes, noticing the details that revealed a man's character: the uncluttered shelves, the handmade solid wood table, the well-kept stove that still held warmth from the morning meal. There was no luxury there, but there was no sloppiness either. It was the home of someone who respected what he owned. Sarah stood near the entrance, as if still considering the possibility of escaping. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched a small travel bag, and she avoided looking directly at Petter. The reality of being in the home of a stranger, a man she was supposed to marry, seemed to be finally settling into her young mind. Petter lit 2 lanterns, filling the house with a golden light that eased the tension of the moment a little. He moved with the economy of gestures, typical of someone who had lived alone for a long time, each action being the result of well-established routines. He offered fresh water and indicated where the women could cool off after the long journey. Elizabeth accepted the hospitality with a respectful nod, but maintained her vigilant posture. It was evident that she had taken on the role of Sarah's protector, a responsibility she took very seriously. While her younger sister retired to wash, Elizabeth remained in the main room, clearly intending to have a private conversation with Petter. The conversation that followed was unlike anything Petter had imagined when he wrote those letters to Denver. Elizabeth spoke about their family, about the difficulties they faced after the death of their parents, about how Sarah had agreed to the marriage more out of desperation than will. Her words were direct, blunt, painting a picture of two women alone in the world, trying to survive as best they could. Petter listened in silence, beginning to understand that there was much more complexity to this situation than his romantic letters had suggested. The Sarah he had imagined through the correspondence was a creation of his own need for companionship, not necessarily the real woman who now took refuge in his bathroom. Elizabeth went on to explain that she had used her savings to accompany Sarah on the trip, that she could not simply allow her sister to face such a drastic change of life alone. There was something about his determination that reminded Petter of his own mother, a woman who had raised 5 children on the border without ever showing weakness in the face of adversity. When Sarah finally returned, she looked a little more composed, though she still retained that air of a cornered animal. She had exchanged her travel dress for something simpler, and her blonde hair was now loose over her shoulders. She was a beautiful woman, Petter had to admit, but her beauty was overshadowed by the evident fear she carried in her eyes. The evening meal was prepared in awkward silence. Petter did what he could with the groceries he had available, while Elizabeth watched his movements in the kitchen with professional interest. It was clear that she knew how to cook, and her hands seemed to be eager to help, but she held back, respecting the host's territory. Sarah ate little, stirring the food on her plate more than actually feeding herself. Every noise of the house seemed to startle her, the wind beating on the windows, the wood crackling as it cooled with the arrival of night, even the sound of her own breaths on the table. It was as if she was constantly waiting for something terrible to happen. The issue of sleeping arrangements finally had to be addressed. Petter offered his own room to the two women, saying he would sleep in the main room. Elizabeth gratefully accepted the proposal, but Petter could see in her eyes that she fully understood the sacrifice he was making. It wasn't just a matter of physical comfort, but of forgoing one's own personal space to accommodate visitors who didn't even know if they would stay. As the women got ready for bed, Petter went out to check on the animals one last time. The night was clear, with stars shining brightly in the cloudless sky. The fresh air helped clear his confused thoughts. He had spent months imagining his new life with Sarah, but now he realized that he might have fallen more in love with the idea of marriage than with the real person. When she returned home, she could hear low voices coming from the room. The sisters were talking, and though she couldn't make out the words, the tone suggested a serious discussion about the future. Petter lay down on the sofa in the living room, staring at the wooden ceiling that he had installed himself board by board, and wondered if he had made a terrible mistake in picking up a mail-order wife. Dawn came with the sound of Elizabeth moving silently through the kitchen. Petter woke up to the aroma of fresh coffee and something he hadn't felt in a long time, the smell of bread being prepared. He got up from the couch, his back sore from the uncomfortable night, and found Elizabeth working with the efficiency of someone who knew a kitchen well. She had found the flour he kept for emergencies and turned simple ingredients into something that reminded him of a real home. His movements were precise, economical, as if each gesture had been perfected through years of necessity. When she realized that Petter was awake, she just nodded and continued her work, as if preparing breakfast for him was the most natural thing in the world. Sarah appeared shortly after, still with her eyes swollen from sleep or tears. She had spent a good part of the night awake, that was evident. She sat at the table without saying a word, accepting the cup of coffee that Elizabeth placed in front of her with hands that were still shaking slightly. The silence between the three people was dense, loaded with decisions that needed to be made. It was Elizabeth who finally addressed the situation head-on. She put her hands on the table and looked directly at Petter, his words cutting through the morning air with crystal clarity. Sarah wasn't prepared for the wedding, she said. The young woman had agreed to the arrangement in a moment of desperation, but the reality of the situation was beyond what she could bear at that moment. Petter listened without interruption, though every word was like a blow to his carefully constructed expectations. He had invested so much emotionally in the idea of that wedding that facing its impossibility seemed to deconstruct the entire future he had planned. But looking at Sarah, seeing the genuine fear in her eyes, he knew Elizabeth was right. The proposal Elizabeth made next was as unexpected as her arrival had been. She offered to stay and work on the farm in exchange for shelter and food, at least until Sarah recovered enough to decide her own future. He was not proposing marriage, but rather a practical partnership. She had experience in domestic management, knew how to handle animals, and was not afraid of heavy labor. Sarah looked up for the first time that morning, looking at her sister in surprise. It was clear that the two had discussed various possibilities during the night, but this proposal seemed to have been made at that very moment. There was something in Elizabeth's eyes that suggested she had assessed not only the practical situation, but also the man before her. Petter considered the offer quietly. His farm really needed help, especially with the housework he had always neglected in favor of cattle care. Elizabeth demonstrated in just one morning that her presence could transform that house into something more like a home. But there was more than practicality in his consideration. The morning progressed, with Elizabeth naturally taking over the household chores, while Petter showed the property to the two women. Sarah remained close to the house, clearly uncomfortable with the open spaces and the sounds of the animals. But Elizabeth asked practical questions about the cattle, about the challenges of breeding, about future plans for the farm. There was a sharp intelligence behind Elizabeth's questions, an instinctive understanding of how a rural operation worked. She had grown up on a farm before the family lost everything, she explained, when Petter commented on her knowledge. He knew the value of hard work and had no romantic illusions about life on the frontier. During the walk, Petter found himself watching Elizabeth with growing admiration. She lacked Sarah's delicate beauty, but possessed something more substantial, a solid, reliable presence. When she stopped to examine a broken fence he had been putting off fixing for weeks and commented on the best way to make the repair, Petter felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. By late afternoon, when they sat on the porch to escape the heat, the decision seemed to have already been made without words. Sarah had spent the entire day in a state of visible anxiety, clearly relieved that she was not being pressured to fulfill an appointment for which she was not prepared. Elizabeth, on the other hand, seemed to have found her place in that barren environment with an ease that surprised everyone. The sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and red that reflected in the dry land. The afternoon wind brought the familiar smell of the prairie, a mixture of dry grass and heated earth that Peter had learned to associate with home. For the first time since the arrival of the women, he felt a kind of peace descending on the property. Elizabeth broke the afternoon silence with a remark about the cattle she had noticed during the walk, something about the need to supplement feed before winter. It was a practical concern, the kind of conversation Petter had missed since he began living alone. For the first time in months, he found himself discussing future plans with someone who truly understood the challenges he faced. 3 weeks later, the farm had transformed in ways Petter never thought possible. The garden that Elizabeth planted behind the house was beginning to show the first green shoots, a promise of life in the midst of the arid land. The fence she had suggested repairing was now solid again, and the corral rearranged more efficiently. Each change was small, but together they created something he never had before, a real home. Sarah had found her place too, though in a different way than anyone expected. She discovered a natural aptitude for caring for the smaller animals on the farm, especially the chickens that Elizabeth had convinced Petter to buy in town. The young woman spent hours talking softly with the birds, and for the first time since her arrival, She smiled with genuine tranquility. Fear had given way to a quiet peace that matched her gentle nature. Elizabeth and Petter had developed a work routine that worked like the well-oiled gears of a clock. She would wake up first to brew coffee and check on the house, while he tended to the morning cattle. They would meet for breakfast and plan the day, discussing necessary repairs, issues with the animals, or changes that could improve the farm's productivity. It was a partnership that had grown naturally based on mutual respect and shared goals. The conversations between them had evolved beyond practical needs. Elizabeth told stories of her childhood on the family farm, and Petter shared memories of when he had built his property with his own hands. They discovered that both had lost important people too soon, and that both had learned to find strength in self-reliance. There was an understanding between them that transcended words. One morning, as they repaired the roof of the barn together, Elizabeth took a break from work and looked out over the landscape that stretched to the horizon. He commented that he had found something there that he did not expect to find, a place where he could be useful without having to hide his strength. Petter stopped hammering and looked at her, seeing no longer the protective sister who had arrived uninvited, but a woman who had become essential to his life. The decision came naturally, as the best decisions usually do. There was no formal proposal or grandiose promises. Instead, during a particularly hot afternoon, when they were sitting on the porch after a hard day's work, Elizabeth casually mentioned that she had written a letter to an old acquaintance in Denver, explaining that she had found a new home and would not be returning. Petter felt his heart race, but kept his answer simple. He said he was happy with her decision, that the farm had become a better place with his presence. Elizabeth smiled then, a genuine smile that completely transformed her face, revealing a beauty that had nothing to do with youth or delicacy, but with the satisfaction of a woman who had found her place in the world. Sarah, who had watched the relationship grow between her sister and Petter, expressed her own decision a few nights later. She had written to a family in Denver who were looking for a housekeeper for their young children. It was a job that matched her gentle nature and her education as a teacher. She would leave next month, but not as a fugitive from an unwanted marriage, but as a woman who had found the courage to choose her own path. Sarah's farewell was emotional, but not tragic. Elizabeth had created an environment where her younger sister could find her own strength, and now she was ready to face the world alone. The two women hugged each other for a long time on the morning of departure, knowing that they would see each other again, but as different people from those who had arrived in that dusty wagon. When the wagon disappeared on the road that cut through the property, Elizabeth and Petter were left alone for the first time. The silence between them was comfortable, full of future possibilities. She put her hand on his arm, a simple gesture that sealed a commitment built on weeks of working together and understanding each other. That night, as they cooked dinner together in the kitchen, Petter realized that he had received exactly what he needed, even if it wasn't what he had ordered. Elizabeth was not the delicate bride he had imagined through the letters, but rather a real partner, someone who could share both the burdens and the joys of a life on the border. Fate, he mused as he watched Elizabeth season the stew as efficiently as she did everything else, had a peculiar sense of humor. He had commissioned a young bride and received a mature woman. He had asked for company and found a true partnership. She had waited for romance and discovered something much more valuable, a connection based on respect, shared work, and the deep understanding of two people who knew exactly who they were and what they wanted out of life. The night wind continued its eternal dance across the plain, but now it carried with it promises of the future instead of just the loneliness of the past. If this story of courage and transformation has touched your heart, you can't miss our upcoming adventures in the American Wild West, where men and women face the challenges of the frontier in search of their destinies. Subscribe to the channel to follow more exciting stories about pioneers who discovered that sometimes what we get is much better than what we ask for.